has been considerable excitement surrounding the data and the actual process of vaccine development by OVG and AstraZeneca. Could you break the process down for us a little bit, explaining how the Chad OX1 nCoV-19 vaccine works? What trials phases are you in right now, and what breakthroughs have you made?
Well, the way the vaccine works is actually rather similar to most of the other vaccines in development, in that what we're trying to do is to induce immune responses to spike protein. And spike protein is the protein that decorates the surface of coronavirus, and the virus uses it in order to enter into the cells in our body to cause infection. And what we're trying to do is to make neutralizing antibodies which bind onto spike protein and stop the virus being able to get into our cells and cause infection. And so this new data published in The Lancet this week shows that we can make those neutralizing antibodies in our volunteers when we vaccinate them with this vaccine. In addition to that, the vaccine also induces a type of white blood cell called T cells, which are able to destroy our cells if they get infected by the virus and to try and halt the infection. So the combination of those two is exactly what we hoped we'd be able to induce with the vaccine. So it's a really important milestone. But we haven't quite got there yet, because we now need to find out whether those immune responses are enough to protect people from infection.
Right. So I was going to ask you about the efficacy question. So a couple of issues there. Firstly, is it possible that, what you said about the spike protein, that the virus itself could mutate and thereby render the vaccine maybe less than effective as seen at the trials?
It's a really important question, and we don't know the answer to that yet. So far, we don't see evidence that the spike protein itself has mutated so that the vaccines wouldn't work. But it's something that has to be monitored because these viruses, as they pass from person to person and they make new viruses, they do make mistakes in their genetic code, which could allow these mutations to arise and for new forms of spike protein to develop. One of the reasons why it might not have happened so far as we can see, is that if they have big mutations in the spike protein, they wouldn't be able to infect our cells anymore, and it would be a dead end for the virus. But it is something that needs monitoring. Of course, with the influenza virus, that's exactly what happens each year, and why we need to have a different flu vaccine used each year. But it does also mean that if the coronavirus did this, we would have to use a similar strategy and keep changing the vaccine as we do for flu.
And is that a very complex or time-consuming process?
I don't think it would be terribly complex to do. There'd be a lot of work with regulators to work out how the process could happen at pace each year. But it may actually be rather easier than for flu vaccines, just because of the way the manufacturing process works for coronavirus.
Okay, and going back to the vaccine, how strong was the immune response seen? Is that something worth getting excited about?
Well, it's the right question, but we don't know how strong an immune response is needed for protection. All we can say is that we're seeing immune responses that are better after a second dose, but they're also not so bad after a first dose. But we don't know whether those are enough for protection. That's why we have to continue with these trials.
Okay, and so is it also an open question as to whether some people might get protected less effectively than others? Should it become available widely?
I think it's likely that there will be some differences in immunity between people. And a particular hurdle is for older adults, particularly those over 70, where we know their immune systems just don't crank up as much when they're vaccinated. And so it may be that it's more of a hurdle to get good immune responses in that age group. And we're actually studying that at the moment. You did ask me what phase of trials we were in. So the data we published is from phase 1, but we're now in the phase 3 trials with more than 10,000 people around the world who have been vaccinated to try to answer this question about protection.
Okay. And just speaking of what you're doing in your lab, there are obviously others doing it. I think about 100 at least potential vaccine processes underway. Are there differences between them? Would we expect differences in the way they finally turn out in terms of impact on population?
Well, there are lots of different technologies being used, which is great because it means that we have more chances of actually being able to control the virus if one or more of those work. But in the end, many of them are using this same approach of trying to make immune responses against the spike protein. And I think the great news there is if one of the vaccines that takes this approach works, it's likely we've got multiple hits on target. And that's very good news for the world, where we will need a lot of vaccine. And so having multiple developers successful will be extremely good news.
Okay. And so speaking of again, this vaccine process, how soon do you think this will be ready? I know there are lots of uncertainties and it has to go step by step, but what sort of time frame are we looking at in terms of getting it available more widely?
Well, it's the impossible question to answer because it's determined by how many cases occur amongst the population we vaccinated, because we can only tell whether we got protection with the vaccine if we can prevent infection in our population of vaccinees. And that's determined by how much transmission of virus there is in the populations we're working in. And although I can tell you quite a lot about how much transmission there was last week, I don't know how much transmission is going to be next week, and that's when we need to be studying the protection from the vaccine. If I knew the future, I could answer your question, but I don't at the moment.
Right, fair point. I'm thinking basically from the point of view of a country like India, which is right now the third largest number of cases, and it's rapidly rising in rank. And I think the prognosis for us is that by 2021, it's going to be possibly the largest number of cases, very severe in any case. So in such a scenario, how much effectiveness do you see this vaccine having once it's started rolling out into the population? Will it take 1 year, 2 years, or even more to actually bring the pandemic to a halt?
Well, the answer is that the pandemic comes to a halt when enough people are immune in the population that the virus can no longer transmit from person to person. And there's two ways we get immunity. One is by getting infection, and the other is through vaccination. And for many diseases, we actually build up our immunity through getting the infection in childhood. So that would be true actually for many coronaviruses that exist in the world today. We've all had them as children, and that's built up our immunity. The difference here is that this is a new virus that no humans have seen before. And so it will take a while for that immunity to build up. And of course, the problem is that if you just have the wild virus spreading until everyone's immune, there'll be lots of people dead in the meantime. And so that's where the vaccines may be able to intervene there by generating immunity for people, so that they don't have to get the consequences of infection. And so really, to answer your question, we need to have enough doses of vaccine available, and then we need to be able to vaccinate enough people to stop the virus in its tracks. And that's quite a big deal. First of all, you've got to manufacture at an enormous scale for a country like India to be able to vaccinate a large proportion of the population. And then we actually have to get out and deliver the vaccine on a scale that's never been seen before. And that's also a big hurdle. So I think the logistics of, even if you have a vaccine and you've got enough doses to actually prevent infection in everyone, is going to be a huge mass vaccination program. And I think many countries are thinking initially about how to protect those at greatest risk, like the hospital workers, like older individuals, and those who've got other health problems. And that's probably the right way to start, to make sure that those who are most vulnerable are protected first.
Okay, and is there more that governments could do, India or elsewhere, in terms of just public health, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of designing a policy to roll this out beyond just looking at the right targets?
Well, it's not for me to speak about what the Indian government should do, but I think it's really important that in every country there are public health organizations looking at this question very carefully about, if we did have a vaccine, how should it be used in our country, and how best should we deliver it? And I think that this is an urgent question for all countries, because it does feel to me that if we did have a vaccine, it does get us out of this mess much earlier than if we don't.
And in that regard, you do think that we're looking at early 2021, or is it looking like it might be later in the year? What's your...
Well, you've come back to the same question that I couldn't answer.
Crystal ball stuff, but...
I don't know. I mean, everything is possible. So it's certainly possible this year, or it might take into next year. I don't know.
Okay, okay. And finally, just in terms of the science that has gone into it, not so much the economic angle, but the science and the research has gone in. What sort of price range are we looking at, or is that something that you wouldn't be able to speculate on?
I don't know what price range would be. I did hear Mr. Poonawalla from Serum Institute of India speaking earlier today and giving some suggestions of the sort of price. But I think the important thing for most people in the world is that governments are likely to pay for this or to have funding externally from international organizations to help them. So hopefully for individuals being vaccinated, this will either be no cost or a very low cost. And I think that this is important, and the partnership that Oxford has made with AstraZeneca is a not-for-profit partnership to try to make sure that we are able to ensure equitable access around the world.
Okay, has that been, to your knowledge, the approach followed by others? I think there are a couple of US companies, Pfizer and a few others. Are they following a similar philosophy in a sense?
I don't know what arrangements other companies have made, but there is this facility that will help fund vaccines, particularly for developing countries, to make sure there's equitable access.
Okay, okay. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate your time and great speaking to you. Hope we can maybe circle back to you as the process unfolds further. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.